Snow bit into Stella Bell's bare feet as she ran. Each step over gravel and ice-tearing skin she no longer felt. The wedding dress clung to her legs, soaked and heavy, ripped high enough to show blood streaked along her calves. The cold burned her lungs. Fear kept her moving. She did not look back until she heard the hooves. The sound froze her where she stood, breath caught somewhere between panic and prayer. When she turned, words spilled from her before she could stop them.
Please, don't take me back. I can't go back.
Her voice breaking. The rider slowed a few paces away. Lantern light brushed a stranger's face dust. Winter, restraint. He did not reach for her. He only looked, taking in the torn dress, the shaking hands, the terror she could no longer hide. "This road isn't safe," he said. "Not at night." Then recognition struck her, sharp and impossible. "Jonathan," she whispered. He paused, surprised that she knew his name.
"Get on, I'll take you somewhere else."
Jonathan Finch said quietly. And Stella stepped forward, choosing the unknown over the life she had escaped. Before the story continues, know that these stories survive because you listen, because you care, and because you choose to stay until the end. Please like the video, subscribe, and share this story with someone who appreciates quiet Wild West stories, frontier romances. Your support matters more than you know. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to see how far these stories have traveled. Kentucky at the edge of the 18th century was not a place that asked questions. It took what it could hold and let the rest drift away into the hills. The law arrived late, if it arrived at all, and what passed for order was usually owned by whoever had a roof, a fire, and enough coin to keep both burning through winter. In Stella Bell's town, that power belonged to a single building at the center of the road, Edmund Hale's Tavern. Stella had come to that tavern without a name anyone bothered to remember. She was small, thin, and quiet. A child left behind by people who did not return. Edmund Hale took her in because the work needed doing, and because a girl who owed everything was less likely to ask for more. Stella learned early how to carry plates without spilling, how to keep her eyes down when men drank too much, how to listen without appearing to hear. She slept in a narrow room near the kitchen and learned to make herself useful before she learned to make herself known. What she wanted most was not comfort, but permission to stay, to belong, to be tolerated without apology. She learned the shape of patience. She learned that silence could be safer than truth. Lillian Hale grew up in the same rooms, but on the other side of an invisible line. She was Edmund's daughter, born into a place that answered to her name. Where Stella learned to step aside, Lillian learned to step forward. She had her father's dark hair and his certainty, and from an early age she understood how the tavern bent around her needs. Men smiled when she passed, women deferred, even Edmund softened when she spoke. And yet, for all that difference, it was Lillian who first reached for Stella. They shared chores before they shared secrets, scrubbing floors together, carrying buckets from the well, laughing over mistakes that would have earned Stella a sharp word if made alone. When Stella woke from nightmares, she did not understand. It was Lillian who climbed into her narrow bed and told her stories until morning, when men looked too long. Lillian showed Stella where to stand and when to disappear. She taught her how to survive without ever calling it that. To Stella, Lillian was not just a friend. She was proof that the world could choose you and keep choosing you as they grew older. The balance shifted in ways Stella noticed but did not name. Lillian was chosen first for conversation, for attention, for opportunity. Stella learned to wait. It was not resentment, it was habit. Lillian did not need to take anything from Stella, because Stella offered it freely. That was the shape of their bond, one giving, one receiving, both believing it was kindness. When Jonathan Finch began to appear at the tavern, nothing seemed different at first. He came with dust on his boots and the quiet of someone who did not expect to be remembered. He spoke little, paid fairly, and left no promises behind him. Stella noticed him because he did not look through her. He asked her name once and used it again weeks later, as if it mattered that he had kept it. Their conversations were small and unremarkable: weather, roads, the price of feed, but something steady formed in the space between them. Not desire, as Stella had been warned about it, loud and demanding, but recognition. When Jonathan looked at her, she felt seen without being claimed. Lillian noticed before Stella did. She began to linger near the bar when Jonathan was present, to place herself between him and Stella without appearing to do so. She teased Stella gently afterward, asking questions that sounded like concern. Was he kind? Was he serious? Did Stella think a man like that stayed anywhere long? Her tone was light, sisterly, protective. Stella did not hear the warning beneath it. When Jonathan left town with the change of season, Stella felt the absence like a bruise she had not expected. Lillian offered to carry her letters, smiling as if it were nothing at all. Of course she would help. Of course she would make sure they were delivered. Who else could Stella trust? That was how the pattern was set, quietly and completely. By the time Stella understood that something was wrong, she had already been moved from the tavern to a room above a traveler's inn owned by a man whose name carried weight. The door was never locked, but it might as well have been. The days stretched without explanation. The future remained a sentence no one finished. And through it all, Lillian came and went with news, with reassurance, with hands folded neatly in her lap. She was the only thread tying Stella to the world she had known. Stella held on because she did not know how to let go. It never occurred to her that the person who kept her company might also be the one keeping her there. Stella did not remember a single moment when her life changed direction. There was no argument, no struggle, no night when she packed her things and chose differently. What she remembered instead was a sequence of ordinary days that slid quietly out of alignment. At first, Edmund Hale spoke of practicality. The tavern was crowded, he said. Travelers came in waves now, and space was needed for paying guests. It would only be temporary. A room had been arranged above a nearby traveler's inn, clean, respectable, closer to the center of town. Stella would still work at the tavern. Nothing else would change. Lillian stood beside him when he said it, nodding in agreement, her expression calm and reassuring. She took Stella's hand afterward and squeezed it lightly, as if to promise that this was only a small adjustment, not a turning point. Stella believed her. She had learned long ago that when people who mattered spoke with certainty, you accepted their words or risked being left behind. The inn belonged to Lawrence Lockwood. Stella knew the name before she ever met the man. Everyone in town did. Lockwood controlled wagons, supplies, and credit along the road that cut through the hills. He owned more than one building, more than one piece of land, and more influence than he ever displayed openly. Men spoke of him carefully, with a kind of respect that bordered on caution. Women lowered their voices when his name entered a room. The inn itself was well kept. Fresh linens, solid doors, a staircase that creaked softly underfoot. Stella's room was on the upper floor, facing the road. It had a bed, a chair, a small table, and a window that looked out over the roofs of town. The door closed easily behind her, and no one locked it. That detail mattered to her at first. She told herself it meant she was still free. The first night passed without incident. The second followed much the same. She was told when meals would be brought. She was told when she was expected downstairs. She was not told how long she would stay. When Stella asked, the answers were gentle and incomplete. Just for a little while, until things settled, until arrangements were finished. No one explained what those arrangements were. When she pressed Lillian for clarity, Lillian smiled and brushed her concerns aside, saying it was nothing to worry about, that her father was only being careful, that men like Lockwood preferred order. It was only after days became weeks that Stella began to understand something was wrong. She noticed that her work at the tavern stopped. Someone else took her place without explanation. She was no longer asked to come down unless Lillian or Edmund was present. The town outside her window continued as usual, wagons passing, voices rising and falling, but her connection to it thinned until it felt unreal, like a scene observed through glass. Lockwood visited rarely and spoke little when he did. He was polite in a distant way, never raising his voice, never touching her. He asked general questions about her health, her comfort, her needs. When Stella tried to ask him why she was there, he answered with phrases that sounded reasonable but meant nothing. Everything in time. Patience was a virtue. She would understand soon enough. Soon never arrived. The door remained unlocked, but leaving was never presented as an option. The innkeeper deferred to Lockwood. The staff took their instructions from him. When Stella stood at the top of the stairs once, intending to walk out, the silence that followed made her stop. No one barred her way. They simply waited, as though confident she would not go far. That was when fear began to replace confusion. Lillian continued to visit, always alone, always calm. She brought small comforts, new ribbons, a book, news from the tavern. She spoke of Jonathan Finch only when Stella asked, and even then her answers were vague. He had come by once, she said, but had not stayed long. Men like that were restless. Stella should not build hopes on passing things. Stella wrote letters anyway. She wrote carefully, choosing words that would not alarm, folding the pages neatly before handing them to Lillian. Each time, Lillian promised to deliver them herself. Each time. She returned with a look of mild regret and no reply. Weeks turned into months. Months stretched into a year, then beyond. The room above the inn became the boundary of Stella's world. She was not beaten. She was not starved. She was simply held in place by courtesy, expectation, and the quiet authority of a man whose name carried weight. By the time Stella understood that this was not a pause, but a holding pattern, the future had already been decided without her, and the only person she trusted to tell her the truth was the one person who never did. Stella learned to measure time in small, manageable pieces. Morning light across the floor, the sound of wagons below her window, footsteps on the stairs that were not meant for her. She kept herself orderly because disorder invited questions, and questions invited answers she did not want to hear. Writing became her one deliberate act. She wrote to Jonathan Finch the way she had learned to do everything else carefully, without excess. She told him she was safe. She told him she had been moved for practical reasons. She did not write of fear or confinement, because she was not yet ready to name either. Each letter ended the same way, with a simple hope that he would write back when he could. Lillian took the letters without hesitation. She read none of them in Stella's presence. She folded them, tucked them away, and promised they would be delivered. Her visits were steady, her tone unchanged. She spoke of the tavern as if Stella were only absent for a season. She spoke of her father's concerns, of business, of the way the town depended on certain arrangements remaining undisturbed. When weeks passed without reply, Stella blamed the roads. Winter made messengers unreliable. Spring floods slowed travel. She had lived in Kentucky long enough to know that distance could swallow intentions whole. When months passed, she began to question herself. Perhaps she had said too much, perhaps too little. Perhaps Jonathan had moved on, as men like him did. Still, she wrote. What Stella did not see was Jonathan's side of the silence. He returned to the tavern in early summer, dust-worn and tired, expecting to find Stella behind the counter as he always had. Instead, someone else handed him his drink. When he asked after her, the answer came easily. She was away for a few days. Family matters. Nothing serious. Jonathan stayed longer than he intended. He came back the following week. Then again after that, each time. The explanation shifted but never broke. Stella was busy. Stella had been sent on an errand. Stella would return soon. Lillian delivered the words with sympathy, as if she regretted the inconvenience as much as he did. When Jonathan finally left a letter of his own, Lillian accepted it with a nod and a familiar smile. She said she would make sure it reached Stella. He thanked her and rode out before doubt could find him. The next time Jonathan came to town, the truth arrived already shaped. Stella had been married, Lillian said. Not recently, some time ago. The arrangement had been settled quietly. It was better that way. A man of means had taken responsibility for her. Jonathan listened without interruption, letting the words settle like dust. He did not ask who the man was. He did not ask why he had not been told sooner that night. Lillian poured him a drink he did not ask for. She spoke gently, telling him that some people were not meant to stay, that stability mattered more than affection. Jonathan drank because it was easier than arguing with a story that left no room for him. He rode out before dawn and did not return. Above the inn, Stella waited. She waited through seasons she could no longer track. Lillian's visits grew less frequent, though never entirely absent. When Stella asked about Jonathan, Lillian answered with practiced calm. He had not written. He had moved on. Men like him always did. Stella wanted to believe her. Belief was simpler than resistance. Yet something in her began to fracture, not loudly, not all at once, but with the persistent pressure of unanswered questions. She noticed how carefully Lillian avoided specifics, how every reassurance closed a door rather than opening one. The room above the inn had not changed, but Stella had. She began to stand at the window longer. She began to listen for sounds beyond what she was meant to hear. She began to understand that silence could be engineered, that absence could be maintained by design. By the time the word wedding was spoken aloud, quietly, almost as an afterthought, Stella no longer mistook patience for safety. She understood then that the years she had spent waiting were not a delay. They were preparation. And when she was finally given a date, a dress, and a reason to leave the room, Stella did not see it as permission. She saw it as the only opening she would ever get. The first time Stella Bell saw Lawrence Lockwood up close, She understood why people spoke his name with care. He did not look dangerous. That was the most unsettling thing about him. Lockwood was not tall, not broad, not marked by the kind of physical authority that warned you away. He dressed plainly for a man of means, favored dark coats and clean boots, and carried himself with the patience of someone accustomed to being obeyed without raising his voice. When he entered a room, conversation adjusted around him as if by instinct, lowering itself to a more cautious pitch. He came to the inn one afternoon when the light outside was thin and colorless. Stella was sitting by the window, sewing a tear in her sleeve that had been there longer than she cared to admit. She heard his steps on the stairs before she saw him, measured and unhurried. Each footfall placed as though he had nowhere else to be. The innkeeper knocked once, softly, and opened the door without waiting for an answer. "Mr. Lockwood," he said, stepping aside. Lockwood paused at the threshold, eyes sweeping the room with detached interest. He did not look at Stella immediately. Instead, he noted the chair, the table, the bed, the window. Only then did his gaze settle on her, calm and assessing, like a man inspecting property he already believed belonged to him. "I hope you're comfortable," he said. It was not a question. Stella stood because she did not know what else to do. Her hands shook slightly, and she folded them together to hide it. "I don't understand why I'm here," she said. Lockwood smiled, just enough to suggest patience rather than warmth. "Understanding comes later," he replied. "Order comes first." That was how he spoke always, as if the world were a ledger already balanced. And anyone who disagreed simply lacked the necessary information. From that day on, his presence became more regular. He never stayed long. He never touched her. He never raised his voice. Instead, he spoke in assurances that sounded reasonable and explanations that explained nothing. He told her she was safe. He told her arrangements were being finalized. He told her that uncertainty was uncomfortable but temporary. Temporary stretched into months. When Stella asked directly if she was to be married, Lockwood did not deny it. He simply said the timing was not yet right. When she asked to leave, even just to walk the road, he reminded her gently that the world beyond the inn could be unpredictable for a young woman without protection. He spoke as though he were offering shelter rather than confinement. And somehow, he was always correct in the narrowest possible sense. The door to her room remained unlocked. No guard stood at the stairs. No threat was ever spoken aloud. Yet every path outward bent back toward him, reinforced by the quiet compliance of the innkeeper, the deference of the staff, and the weight of a name that carried consequences. Time lost its shape. Stella stopped counting days because days led nowhere. She learned instead to measure the world by Lockwood's visits, by Lillian's footsteps, by the seasons visible from her window. Snow melted, grass returned, snow came again. Through it all, Lillian remained her only constant. She came bearing news, small comforts, reminders of a life Stella was no longer allowed to touch. She spoke of the tavern, of her father's business, of how difficult things had become with Lockwood involved. She framed every hardship as necessity, every decision as something already in motion. "He's not a bad man," Lillian said once, smoothing a ribbon between her fingers. "He just believes in stability." Stella stared at her, something cold coiling in her chest. "And what do I believe in?" Lillian hesitated, just briefly. "You believe in surviving," she said. "You always have. The words sounded like praise. They felt like a sentence. It was only much later that Stella realized Lillian never spoke of love, never spoke of choice. She spoke only of outcomes. The wedding was announced without ceremony. Lockwood arrived one morning with fabric samples and a date already set. He spoke as though the matter had been agreed upon long ago, as though Stella's consent were an inconvenience already resolved. The dress would be simple and respectable. The guests would be few. Discretion mattered. Stella listened in silence, her mind strangely clear. That night, Lillian came later than usual. She sat on the edge of the bed and reached for Stella's hands, holding them as she had when they were girls.
It will be over soon.
Lillian said, "Once this is done, things will make sense again." Sense to whom Stella asked. Lillian did not answer. Something in that silence broke what remained of Stella's willingness to wait. She began to plan, not with hope, but with precision. She watched the rhythm of the inn more closely than ever, noting when doors were left open, when staff moved in clusters, when attention drifted. She understood now that Lockwood did not fear her escape because he did not believe she would try. He had mistaken her endurance for obedience. The wedding day arrived under a sky heavy with snow. The inn filled with movement women carrying bundles of fabric, men bringing food and drink, voices overlapping in a chaos Stella had not heard in years, for the first time since she had been brought there. No one watched her closely. The room she had lived in became a passageway, not a boundary. They dressed her quickly. The gown was pale and unforgiving, its fabric stiff with expectation. It hid nothing of how thin she had become. When they laced it tight, Stella barely reacted. Pain had long since stopped being persuasive. She caught her reflection in the small mirror by the door and almost did not recognize herself. Not because she looked like a bride, but because she looked like someone already gone. When they left her alone to finish preparing, the door stood open. That was all she needed. She did not take anything with her. No shoes, no coat, no proof of who she had been. She stepped into the corridor and moved as though she belonged there. Head lowered, hands steady, no one stopped her. Why would they? She was supposed to be there. Outside. The cold hit her like a blow. Snow cut through the thin fabric of her dress. Gravel tore at her feet. The pain was immediate and sharp and undeniable. It was also real. Stella ran. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stop. Each step away from the inn loosened something inside her, something that had been clenched for 2 years. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out, until fear became less specific and more survivable. When she reached the road, she kept running. She did not know that Lockwood would discover her absence within the hour. She did not know that his response would be swift and controlled. That pressure would fall on Edmund Hale like a hand closing around a throat. She did not know that Lillian would be sent out into the night, not out of loyalty but necessity. What Stella knew, as she ran barefoot through snow and stone, was that, if she stopped, time would claim her again. She would not let it. The hooves she heard behind her on that frozen road did not sound like pursuit at first. They sounded like inevitability. And then Jonathan Finch appeared out of the dark. And the future split open in a way Stella had not dared to imagine. She did not know yet how much had been taken from her. She did not know how carefully that loss had been managed. She knew only that she had escaped a man who owned buildings, money, and names, and she was no longer willing to be owned by time. They did not travel far that first night. Jonathan Finch guided the horse off the road and into the thin line of trees where the wind cut less sharply. He dismounted without a word, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, as if speed itself might frighten Stella back into flight. When he offered his hand, she took it without thinking. Only after her feet touched the ground did she realize how badly they hurt. The fire was small. Jonathan kept it that way on purpose. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders and turned his back while she adjusted the torn dress, granting her privacy without being asked. When he finally looked at her again, his eyes did not linger on the ripped fabric or the blood at her ankles. He crouched and began tearing strips from the lining of his saddle blanket, binding her feet with care that felt almost ceremonial. "You're safe for now," he said, "but not for long if they're looking." Stella nodded. The cold had settled deep into her bones, but the shaking that took her was not from winter alone. She stared at the fire, at the way it bent and shifted, and wondered how something so small could keep darkness at bay. She had not planned to tell him anything yet. Words felt dangerous. They had always been taken from her, rearranged, returned with meaning she had never intended. But the silence between them was different from the one she had known above the inn. This silence waited.
Why didn't you answer?
She asked suddenly. The question surprised them both. Jonathan's hands stilled. For a moment, Stella thought he might refuse to answer, that he might choose the easier path and let the night absorb the truth. Instead, he sat back on his heels and met her gaze. "I never received anything," he said. "Not one letter." The fire cracked softly. Stella felt something tilt inside her, slow and sickening, like a floor giving way. "I wrote," she said. "I wrote more than once." Jonathan nodded. "I know." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something there she had not expected, weariness layered beneath restraint. "I came back to the tavern," he continued, "more than once. The first time they told me you were away. The second time, I left a letter. Lillian Hale said she'd see it delivered herself." Stella's breath caught. "The third time," Jonathan said, his voice tightening just enough to reveal the cost.
They told me you'd married, quietly, that it was settled.
The words landed between them, heavy and irreversible. "She poured me a drink that night," he added after a pause. "Said it was better not to disturb what couldn't be changed." Stella closed her eyes. In that moment, the past 2 years did not unravel all at once. They aligned. Lillian's calm assurances, the missing replies, the careful way information had always arrived softened, delayed, incomplete. It had not been confusion. It had been management. Stella pressed her palms into the frozen ground to steady herself. When she opened her eyes again, she did not cry. Whatever tears she might have had were locked somewhere deeper, waiting for a safer time. "I was kept in a room above Lockwood's Inn," she said. 2 years. He said it was for my protection." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. "I didn't know how long it would last," she went on. "No one ever told me. Lillian was the only one who came. She said you'd stopped coming by. Said men like you didn't stay." Jonathan exhaled slowly, as if the air itself had weight. The truth settled between them, harsh and unadorned. 2 separate silences, shaped by the same hand. They might have stayed that way longer if the horse had not lifted its head suddenly, ears pricking toward the road. Jonathan was on his feet at once. A shape moved through the trees beyond the firelight. Then another. A single rider emerged, slowing as she approached, as if she wanted to be seen. Lillian Hale stepped into the glow of the flames. She looked different out here, less polished, more rigid, the lines of her mouth drawn tight by something like fear. Her eyes went first to Stella, then to Jonathan, measuring the distance between them. "There you are," Lillian said, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Stella did not answer. "The town is in chaos," Lillian continued. "Lockwood is furious. My father—" She stopped, swallowed. "This doesn't have to get worse. Come back." "Stella, we can still fix this." Jonathan stepped slightly forward, not touching Stella, but close enough that Lillian noticed. "Fix it?" How, he asked. Lillian's gaze flicked to him, irritation breaking through the practiced calm. "This isn't your concern." "It is now," Stella said quietly. Lillian turned back to her, impatience sharpening her voice. "You're cold. You're hurt. You're not thinking clearly. That man can't give you a future." Stella met her eyes. "Neither could you." The words struck harder than any accusation. For a moment, Lillian's composure slipped. "Do you know what Lockwood will do if you don't come back?" she said. "He'll call it abduction. He has friends. He has lawmen who owe him favors." Jonathan's hand flexed at his side, but Stella felt strangely calm. "Then tell him the truth," Stella said. "Tell him I left." Lillian laughed, sharp and humorless. "You don't understand how things work." Stella nodded. "I do now." Jonathan spoke again, his voice even. "What happened to the letters?" Silence fell. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Lillian's eyes moved from Stella to Jonathan and back again, calculation giving way to something raw. They would have ruined everything. She said at last, "You were never meant to last." This, she gestured between them, was a complication. There it was, not a confession born of guilt, but of frustration. "If you don't come back," Lillian said, her voice dropping.
I will tell Lockwood you were taken, and I will make sure he believes it.
Stella looked at the woman she had once trusted with her life and felt the final thread snap. "I'm not going back," she said. Lillian's face hardened. She held Stella's gaze for a long moment, then turned her horse away without another word. The sound of hooves faded into the trees. Jonathan waited until the night swallowed it completely. "Are you sure?" he asked. Stella stepped closer to him, the firelight warming one side of her face. "Yes," she said. "For the first time. I am." He helped her onto the horse, mounting behind her. She hesitated only a moment before reaching back and taking hold of him, her hand resting against his coat. They rode away together, not in flight, but in choice, leaving behind the people who had decided their lives for them, and carrying with them nothing but the truth and the road ahead. They rode until the firelight was only a memory, and the trees thinned into open ground. Snow still fell, lighter now, settling on Jonathan Finch's shoulders and the horse's dark mane. The world ahead was quiet in a way Stella Bell had not known for years, not the silence of confinement, but the kind that waited to be shaped. She sat in front of him on the saddle, wrapped in his coat, her back straight despite the ache in her legs. At first she kept her hands close to herself, as if proximity were another thing that could be taken away. The horse moved at an easy pace, steady and patient, as though it understood the need to go without haste. Jonathan did not ask where she wanted to go. He did not offer plans or promises. He let the road speak for itself. Behind them lay Kentucky's small certainties, The tavern with its warm light and careful rules. The inn with its unlocked door. The man who owned time and called it protection. Stella did not look back. She had spent too long measuring her life by what others allowed. She would not give the past the courtesy of her gaze. The cold bit again as the wind shifted. Without thinking, Stella reached back and rested her hand against Jonathan's coat, just above his hip. A light touch meant only to steady herself. He adjusted slightly, making room without comment. The horse's stride never broke. It struck her then how different this felt from escape. There was no pounding urgency in her chest, no counting of steps, no fear of being caught mid-breath. She was leaving. Yes, but she was also choosing. The distinction mattered. "What if they come after us?" she asked quietly. Jonathan considered the question before answering. "They might," he said, "but not forever. Men like Lockwood don't chase what they can't own." Stella nodded. The truth of it settled easily. Power, she had learned, depended on proximity, on walls, on names, on people who agreed to play their parts. Out here, those things thinned until they lost their shape. They rode on as the sky began to pale at the edges. Dawn did not arrive all at once. It crept in, cautious, testing the ground. The snow softened beneath the horse's hooves. Stella felt the warmth of Jonathan's presence at her back, solid and unassuming. She thought of Lillian Hale not with anger now, but with clarity. The girl who had shared her bed and her secrets, who had taught her how to survive by staying in place. Stella understood at last that survival was not the same as living. Love that demanded silence was not protection. Care that required control was not care at all. Jonathan shifted behind her as the road dipped, his hand briefly steadying her at the waist. It was a practical gesture, nothing more, but it carried a quiet respect that Stella recognized immediately. He was not guiding her. He was riding with her. The sun broke through the clouds in a thin line of gold, catching on the snow and turning it almost gentle. Stella closed her eyes for a moment and breathed. The air tasted clean, unclaimed. She did not know where they would stop. She did not know what work awaited them, or how long the road would be kind. Those questions no longer frightened her. For the first time, uncertainty belonged to her, not to the people who had spoken over her life. They continued on, one horse, one direction. Behind them, the world that had named her and confined her grew smaller with every step. Ahead lay no guarantees, only space enough to speak the truth without asking permission, and time that answered to no one. Stella held fast as the horse carried them forward, not away from something, but toward whatever they would become together. This story reminds us that captivity does not always wear chains. Sometimes it comes as comfort, protection, and decisions made for our own good. Stella's journey shows that silence can be engineered, love can be redirected, and time itself can be stolen when others are allowed to choose our fate. True freedom begins not with rescue, but with recognition the moment we understand we have been controlled rather than cared for. Love, when it is real, does not confine or bargain. It walks beside us, sharing risk and uncertainty. The story teaches that choosing to leave, even without certainty, is often the bravest act of all.